what's going on, guys? So I'm going to do a little video on setting up a Hamilton G5 ventilator. So while I'm focusing on the G5 here, I will say there's quite a bit of overlap between all the Hamilton vents. So if you're trying to do this with a C3 or C2 or anything like that, a C6, there is a lot of similarity, sometimes just finding a different button or where a different measured volume might be. Okay, so I'm not going to show you the circuit setup with the exhalation diaphragm and all that stuff, but I suggest you kind of know how to disable or disassemble and reassemble and attach all of that to make sure you know how to really piece this thing together. I already have our circuit on. I'm going to show you how to do a pre-use check. We're going to talk about the flow sensor and what's kind of unique about the Hamilton vent, and then talk a little bit about vent initiation here. So first thing I'd kind of like to point out on the Hamilton vents, in the adult world, this is something that's kind of really peculiar, okay? In the neo-peds world, or neo world, it's not uncommon. But Hamilton vents, even on adults, use a flow sensor that goes proximal to the patient and distal to the Y right here. All right, so you generally want this as close to a patient, but if we're running like passive humidity with an HME, I usually put an HME distal to this flow sensor. I provide a little bit extra protection against secretions, things like that from building up. So most ventilators have your flow sensor on the expiratory side of the ventilator, so all the gas has got to go through the Y all the way back to the vent before any of the measured flows are turned into volumes, and all of our readout on the ventilator is displayed. Okay. Likewise, same things taking place with triggering. It's all happening back at the expiratory side on most ventilators. And if something goes wrong with the flow sensor, we don't really have the ability to fix that. That's a biomed kind of thing. So by putting the flow sensor right here, get instantaneous measurements. It does some crazy stuff with taking little micro pauses and trying to give us like a pseudo plateau pressure or auto peep and things like that without doing a pause like we would traditionally do. And I still recommend to get a hard value on that. Okay. And you can make an argument that this is going to provide for more responsive triggering abilities. So the flow sensor goes right here. I'm not going to zoom back out and show you where to hook this up with the ventilator, but you can see there's two separate colored lines that do need to be tied back in at the ventilator here. And on the very, very bottom right here, there's our particular one has about 5 different little hookups. There's a couple of labeled flow sensor, and you'll see there's a color-coded shroud up above them that kind of coincides with the color in the flow sensor. So make sure you get that set back up. I'm going to show you how to do a pre-use check here. So what a pre-use check does, make sure the ventilator is functional, make sure you don't have any massive leaks in the system, make sure everything's calibrated and ready to go for a patient. It also does something important that we take for granted on modern vents, and that is compensating for what we know as tubing compliance or circuit compliance. So our circuits not being made out of a rigid material are going to lose a little bit of that volume that's coming out of it that's supposed to go to the patient as the circuit's pressurized, okay? And we don't want that volume loss to occur, so we want the ventilator to figure out how many mils per centimeter of water are lost with each breath, okay? And it's going to, behind the scenes, if we set a tidal volume of 500, it might be given a little bit more, but it ensures that the patient really gets what we set, which is what we really want to take place, okay? Most ventilators do this. There are some out there, especially transport vents, that do not. So I'm going to show you how to access that. I'm going to talk about initial settings here a little bit. All right, so this is the home screen here. So this is also be the screen you get to when you put the ventilator in standby. The power button is shrouded, and on the back, it's got a little hard piece of plastic that covers it so you can't inadvertently shut it down. All right, so I already got the ventilator turned on, but I am in standby here. So from this screen, you can choose, adult, pediatric, or neonate. That in itself doesn't really change anything besides the default, so you'd still have to do your pre-op check and change your circuit and stuff if you're doing neo. All right. So likewise for ideal body weight, okay, all of our ventilating parameters should really be based upon an ideal body weight, and at least once we get a patient stabilized and making adjustments. So you should be able to calculate this, but on these vents as well as a lot of other ones today, you can choose gender and height and inches for this particular one. It tells you their ideal body weight. It's close enough, so if you did the math, like a 5'9" male or 69" male would be like 70.7. This one's 71, which is totally fine. Not going to make a big difference. I will tell you that if you encounter a Hamilton vent that shows you your height in centimeters, okay, most people don't know what their height is in centimeters here in America. You can send me an email, and I can show you how to kind of change a lot of these default settings, and that being one of them. That could be for any of the Hamilton vent series, okay? So a lot of vents out there, all that really does by choosing your ideal body weight and stuff is give you how many mils per kilo you're giving as you're making adjustments. I will say out of all the vents, it is important that if you know their height, right, as soon as you do put that in, because there's a mode on this called ASV that actually comes up with the tidal volume and ventilating parameters based upon this patient's height and their ideal body weight, okay? So if you have this incorrectly and somebody switches over, it's not possibly going to give appropriate ventilator settings for that patient. So it's always important to get in. You can't access this after initiating ventilation. I kind of show you that here. I'm going to go to pre-op check here. So right now I'm running off fake oxygen, so I have our O2 sensor disabled. So you're not going to see oxygen sensor, pre-use test pop up. Usually that would be lit up and enabled. I'm going to check the flow sensor, so I'm going to zero the flow sensor, make sure everything's worked out, make sure this thing's calibrated and functional. And I'm going to do a tightness check, which is checking for a leak, and that's where we're also compensating for the tubing compliance here. All right, this vent, as well as a lot of the Hamiltons, do have built-in volumetric capnography capabilities, and very superior compared to regular, side stream capnography most of you guys are using out there. If I had this plugged in, all right, there's a little module on the front bottom part of this ventilator. This would be lit up, and it would allow me to do that and zero it out and things like that, which I'd recommend. So right now I'm going to just walk through the flow sensor and tightness test. All right. Hopefully your ventilators are already set up for you, but most places you're putting some sort of insignia. Hey, I checked this out at this date, and there's a sticker or something on it. You can go in and actually find when this test was performed and everything as well. Very seldomly are you doing this right before putting it on a patient, but it's always good to have a means of being able to check and make sure that this has been taken care of. Okay. So I'm going to check the flow sensor first. So the flow sensor does require this extra little piece here. Pretty much we got to be able to flip this flow sensor around and mimic gas coming from the patient side as well as the ventilator side. And since we don't have a patient, we need something to allow us to hook inside of that 15 millimeter ID connection right here, and that's going to be this. So I'm going to check the flow sensor. It's going to walk us through, so it's calibration in progress here. Turn flow sensor. It doesn't mean go like this. It means take this piece, all right, and do that. So we're putting it on. If you want to start that little piece on, that's totally fine. I misspoke. It actually goes around the Y instead of, inside that 15 millimeter hub. So we've got a 22 ID adapter here. It's calibrating. You can hear air purging through this thing. We're going to go ahead and it's going to tell us to turn the flow sensor again here in a moment. Turn flow sensor. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and do that. You don't really need this piece anymore, so what I usually do, I'll clip it on those tubing back at the ventilator connection so we don't lose it. Sorry, looking for my coffee. So it's important to note that this test cannot obviously be done while a patient is being ventilated, so if something goes wrong, you'd have to pop them off, manually ventilate, all right? That's why we recommend doing this kind of beforehand. All right, so we passed, we're okay. Next thing I'm gonna do the tightness. I usually use the blue cap that would come with a circuit here. So pardon me, it says tighten patient system. I'd use a gloved finger, but the blue cap would be what you wanna do here. You could also, if you're using HME, have that on, make sure everything's all good. It's gonna tell us tighten patient system. All right, I'm tightening it here, making sure everything's all good. It tells me patient system tight. If it's not, and it's getting a leak, all right, make sure you had everything covered up, check the obvious connections and such. In my experience, the thing that is generally bad is on the exhalation diaphragm. And I'll go ahead and kind of show you that here. On the expiratory side of the ventilator, you have this little weighted diaphragm that sits on top of this exhalation mechanism, okay, and vents the air out. So it's got a little pin that controls the exhalation valve and allows for PEEP and things like that. If you have this in upside down or anything like that, you're going to have problems. I don't know if you can see clear enough. No, not going to be able to, but it's actually labeled and tells you what side to put down. Ultimately, the weight side there is always going to be facing up, and the pin's going to be kind of resting on right there. When you put this in, it just kind of, it seats on a little metal flange, and it kind of turns and locks in place. Okay, so we're tight here, we're good, we got all green lights. The O2 sensor I would do as well. You can calibrate the O2 sensor when it's on a patient, but it should be done ahead of time. Okay, so let's talk about initial settings here. So I wouldn't hook my patient up until I'm ready to roll with their settings here, okay? But for teaching purposes, we're gonna go ahead and go with kind of what we got here. All right, so I got my standby screen, I got my ideal body weight in correctly. Up here, it shows us what our current mode is. So S-CMV on this is like set tidal volume or volume continuous mandatory ventilation or volume assist control if you think about it like that. these are our core settings that are available. So rate of 15, tidal volume of 550. So your two parameters for CO2 elimination or minute ventilation, and then PEEP and FiO2. So your two main parameters for oxygenation. People forget that this is only the beginning of it. Okay, to really access everything, you need to hit controls because we want to be concerned with how we're delivering that 550 mil tidal volume or whatever we got set here. I'm gonna try and come forward a little bit so you can see a little better. So you need to hit controls and then to bring up your peak inspiratory flow, or your peak flow, your flow waveform, tip, which is pause time, which we never really run here in the States, and then your trigger sensitivity. The Hamilton guys will tell you 5 liters is a good value for this, for a flow trigger. By hitting this, you can turn to pressure trigger, and later on we'll talk about situations when you might want a pressure trigger, bronchopleural fistula or extreme auto triggering problems or something like that. If you hit it again, you can turn it off. I'd never really recommend that. Patients should always be able to initiate some level of support. If you want your patient to not be able to trigger breaths, you need to do sedation and chemical paralysis. All right. One thing I'll kind of point out, all the different things that you should be able to calculate could also be found over here on the side. So your rate, and this is just based upon, if the patient's not breathing faster, obviously some of this stuff would change, like your E time and cycle time and stuff like that if they're triggering faster. So rate of 15 on these current settings, you got a total cycle time of 4 seconds. Here's what your I time would be. So if we change our flow rate, if we change our waveform, if we change our tidal volume, you'd see that change kind of in real time here and just kind of show you. So important to be able to find your E time, your IDE ratio, pause time, and then how many mils per kilo we're given of ideal body weight. So if I'm making adjustments on my tidal volume, I can see real time how that tidal volume in mils per kilo is kind of changing. I can maintain lung protective vent. So if this was not the mode you were trying to initiate in, you can go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and kind of click out of this. You hit modes up top. You can find a lot of different things. So this ventilator kind of segregates stuff, whether you realize it or not. All of our kind of pressure targeted stuff, for the most part, is on this left-hand side. This is exceptional for non-invasive, especially the C6s and the C3s, the turbine-driven systems, a very, very responsive leak comp. Because it uses that turbine instead of the medical air. So you got a lot of different options here, your spontaneous, your pressure support, and then you got the volume targeted pressure ventilation here. So your APVs or adjustable pressure ventilation, volume support, adaptive support ventilation, all things we'll get to a little later on. And then the Hamiltons can do as well the high flow oxygen through it, right? So our two true volume modes are S-CMV and straight up S-IMV. Okay, so we're already in the mode we're going to use here, so I'm going to go with it. Let's talk about initial settings here, okay? So most patients we're going to want 6 to 8 mils per kilogram of ideal body weight. We'll refine that later on, okay? Certain situations, ARDS or at risk for ARDS, profound hypoxemic respiratory failure, you might want to opt towards the 6 mil per kilo. Status asthmaticus, 6 might be a good starting point. You might need to be able to go as low as 4, depending on the feedback you get from the ventilator. Normal lungs, 8 mils per kilo is okay. Sometimes I like that if COPD, I'd rather give a larger tidal volume and a lower rate versus smaller and a higher rate, more risk for air trapping and stuff like that. So let's say we got this 69 kilogram patient and I'm giving him a 500 mil breath. Okay, so 7 mils per kilo, pretty standard here. We got to think about, so once you choose a tidal volume, how are we going to give that tidal volume? We got to think about peak flow, okay? So even though 60 liters of flow might be a good starting point, we got to think about the tidal volume and the waveform and things like that, all right? Later on, we'll need to be able to read graphics and get in sync with an active breathing patient. But initially, you want to just try and adjust. 60 can be a good starting point, but you want to think about your I time here. So usually a 0.8 I time, maybe a 1 second I time is good to kind of initiate with the understanding that you might have to adjust that as the patient starts actively trying to trigger breaths. We got to meet their demand, maintain appropriate IDE ratios and stuff like that. So I always recommend kind of taking a look there. And if you want to start, it doesn't have to be exactly 0.8. There's times where we'll go as low as 0.6, times we go to 1.2. And we'll kind of refine that a little bit later on here. Main thing is knowing how it kind of affects things. So I'm going to do peak flow of 55 at a tidal volume of 500. Give me about a 0.82 I time, good IDE, good E time. That all looks good here. So I need to think about my respiratory rate, okay? So I am trying to figure out my initial minute ventilation requirements. And most patients need about 100 mils per kilogram per minute under normal conditions. And if you're severely acidotic or you got some severe VQ disturbance or something like that, or you're really sick, you're febrile, you might need more minute ventilation. So we need to think about the rate tidal volume combination here. I don't like that it doesn't show you your predicted minute ventilation or your delivered minute ventilation until we actually initiate ventilation. So you think about it, if I'm given tidal volume of 500 15 times a minute, what does that come to? Well, we end up giving about 7.5 liters a minute, if I'm not mistaken. So that would probably be maybe even a little bit more than what this patient's basal minute ventilation requirement would be. So if he's 70 kilos times 100, or 71 kilos times 100 mils per kilo, you get 7.1 liters a minute would be their minute ventilation requirements. So I'm overshooting that a little bit, so I could go down just a smidge if I wanted to. And that's closer to about 7. It'd probably be pretty good for that patient. We can kind of adjust. And once again, we'd be looking at a scenario and figuring out more accurate initial settings here. I do want to point out, so most of the time you're going to be initiating with a decelerating flow waveform. The Hamilton gives you a little bit more options than the traditional vent. You got regular decelerating. You also got one that looks very similar called exponential decay. So it's going to really take you almost closer to this inflation and reaching almost a zero flow kind of pause type situation, or right before that prior to cycling off. And you can see it makes a little bit of a longer effect on our eye time there. So keep that in mind as we talk about kind of making changes to eye time later on. And if you're looking and it's like, man, this patient, they're needing a lot of flow and they're flow hungry up front or whatever, but my eye time ends up too short, you can change this and you can kind of maintain a longer eye time even though if you end up going with a little bit of a higher flow rate. So I'm going to adjust this again, try and get us back down to like our 0.8. And you can see with this, I can give a peak flow of 70 and still have a 0.86 eye time. So don't fixate on that too much. I just want you to know it's an option in case you run into a problem too, where if you're having too long of an eye time and you can't figure it out, you might be in the exponential decay and not fully aware of that. All right. You also got sine wave and square flow waveform and stuff like that. We'll talk about that later on. So PEEP and FiO2, most of the time, PEEP of 5 would be a good initial starting point for baseline pressure and everything like that. There's situations in which you're going to need a lot more ARDS patients, morbidly obese patients, significant shunting kind of taking place, a lot of other different issues. We could look at somebody's EPAP they're failing on if they're non-invasive and try and replicate that. So it's something to be considered for most run-of-the-mill, just kind of post-op patients, normal situations. PEEP of 5 should be sufficient to kind of maintain that normal FRC for these patients until they kind of start actively breathing and wake up. FiO2 likewise, we need to be able to look at what a patient is receiving before initiation and intubation and try and come up with an informed decision. If you don't know anything about the patient, you can start at 100 and kind of quickly wean down. Okay, we'd rather give more than enough than not enough and everything, but you don't want to leave them on 100% for a long period of time. We'll say we're going to start this guy in 60%, PEEP of 5. All right. One thing I like to check, so our settings, to make any changes, you just touch, turn, you can touch with the wheel, or you can touch. It is a pressure-sensitive touch screen, so if it's not going, you got to hit it a little bit harder. All right, so all these settings are confirmed right here. Rate of 14, eye time 0.86, got a good E time 7 mils per kilo. We can dig that. One thing I do like to take a quick look at is your alarms, and by hitting the alarm tab underneath your control setting, you can see high pressure alarm. I just verify and make sure that's a safe value if I'm initiating for the first time on a patient. It should default at 40 centimeters of water. We don't want this ventilator to have no restrictions that say give this tidal volume regardless. We want to have a safe pressure limit. 40 is pretty good for starting out, and if it hits it, it'll dump the breath, prematurely cycle, and until we can kind of troubleshoot and figure out and everything, okay? So at this point, that looks pretty good. If I was liking it, I could go ahead, hit start ventilation. I do like to point out that the Hamilton vent is going to pre-silence your alarms for 1 minute. You can see that kind of countdown up here. There's a lot of our values, like our exhaled minute volume and things like that, that are not going to be reached. So it's going to start honking at you right from the get-go. So I do like that it does this. Quick kind of rundown on the screen. So once again, if I wanted to hit any of my settings over here, make changes or find any of the stuff, hit controls and it brings everything up. Okay, otherwise you just got kind of on the fly measurements over here. Good for changes like FiO2 or PEEP. But when I'm changing either my rate or my tidal volume, I like to see how that's kind of affecting my cycle time, E time, all those different things here. So very, very important. And then once again, you got to be able to find your peak flow and everything like that. So graphics-wise, you can customize this by touching and changing things. We can change the loops and all sorts of different things that you might want to do. Okay, and we'll get into those in some kind of later videos. You can look at trending, things like that. All right. Let's see. You can do smaller versions of your scalars, things, all those different types of things, okay? So graphics are customizable. You can also change the time scale. So it's fine on the G5 doing auto. It's a little bit bigger screen. On the C3, I'll hit it. It defaults to like 21 seconds, and everything's tiny. You can change the time scale here for how many seconds it's looking at. Auto is usually pretty good on the G5. Real-time measurements are taking place over here, so you can see peak airway pressure, minute ventilation, my VTE or exhale tidal volume, current respiratory rate is F total, and your I to E. There's also 9 other tables down here of data I can find by hitting this monitoring tab. You can go ahead and get everything kind of pulled up. I was mentioning that little flow sensor would try and take little micro pauses and give you stuff like a plateau when you maybe, if you otherwise couldn't get one. I still don't trust it. I'm going to show you how to get a plateau here in a second, but it tries and gives us an estimated value and everything. So you can see a lot of data here. It calculates time constants, inspired volume versus expired, and a lot of other things we'll get into as we kind of move along. All right. So I like to pull that up rather than hit each of the individual little data tables. Later on, as we get into like spontaneous breathing trials, you got to hit table 2 sometimes to find your RSBI and things like that. You also have, I'm not going to get into IntelliCuff on this video, but you can do cuff pressure control through the ventilator on this as well, all right, if you had that capability. So I'm going to show you how to get a plateau. So right now, 22 centimeters water, 23 centimeters is what it's taken to deliver this tidal volume and overcome airways resistance, lung compliance, chest wall compliance, resistance going through our ET tube, all those different things. Okay, so that's the total in volume ventilation here. You can see my minute ventilation, what I'm expiring is a little bit short of what I was looking for, around that 7 liters a minute. And that's just because our exhale tidal volume is just a little bit short of what's kind of coming back here, and that's okay. I didn't do my pre-use check with my HME, so that could be a little bit of unintended dead space there, and that's totally fine. So we get a blood gas in 30 minutes and check all that stuff. So let's talk about doing a plateau on this vent. All right, it's a little bit more involved. You're going to go to Tools. You're going to try and get it timed up where it's on the left-hand side. You're going to hit Hold. It doesn't hold until it actually gives the breath and then drops down. Okay? And you can see I got my lung set up so it freezes it. I got to use the little wheel on the Hamilton G5. It's going to show me my plateau pressure over here. The C3s and some of them it shows it over here. Be careful. It also shows you time and flow. So the white number is time. It shows you at what point in time you're looking at. We want to find a good period with zero flow movement and allowing total equilibration between the Y and my alveoli. And that would be the pressure we want to take it from. I got resistance turned off on this. Let me make one change here and make this a little bit more realistic. Okay, so I added on a little resistance here. If you noticed on my graphic, I didn't really get a good drop. You see it kind of changes how pressure is built on the system here with that raw and that backup. I'm going to go ahead and do another hold. Very brief, so 1 1,000, 2 1,000. I got a good visible plateau, and that should be okay. I want to scroll back until I get a zero flow point, and I can see my plateau or my alveolar pressure at end inspiration was about 22 and a half. So you could say 23 centimeters of water. You can see it actually took 33 centimeters of water to deliver that, overcome resistance and everything. And looking back through, you can see when I do that pause and air movement's not taking place, it takes resistance out of the picture, and I can reflect, true alveolar conditions. So that's my plateau. All right, I do the same for auto Peep. So if I wanted to see if my patient had air trapping, I could go ahead and do this, and if they had it, you'd see that value continue to rise. All right, you could go back and scroll through. So being able to get a plateau is really important. It's important to understand as well, just because you get a number does not mean that it's accurate. We want to actually truly see that, we got a true zero flow point. If a patient's actively breathing or you got a leak in the system or something like that, we can't report that value. We can't base any clinical decisions off of it. Let's say you did not know your patient's height and ideal body weight beforehand. You could go ahead, now that you got them stabilized, you go ahead and hit patient, all right? And this would be where you could kind of add everything in at this point, okay? We'll talk later on about adding ET tube compensation. We're not really using side too much here in the States right now or anything like that. But we'll get into all those things kind of at a later time. So I would go back through and kind of confirm my alarms. And on this vent, let me see if I can scroll forward just a little bit. You got your high pressure, typically 10 to 15 centimeters of water in this type of mode, and PRVC sometimes, or APV, we'd have to consider another little bit of a buffer. So I could go up. I don't want it too tight. I'm already at 35, 36, 37 centimeters of water, so I could set this a little tighter, 45, 40 would be a little too tight. Exhale minute volume, so if you look really close, there's little green dashes that shows me where my current values are. The circles are where the alarms are currently set. All right, so most patients, I'm not going to go too much lower than about 5 liters a minute for an adult. Um, and they're in mandatory ventilation right now in volume, so low minute volume shouldn't be any problem. Okay, hopefully if that takes place, we got some other things kind of taking place. But if you had a big leak or something like that, might let you know. Expired minute volume, you could go 50% above. Some people just had 2 to 5 liters above or something like that. So 50% is like another 3.5. I'm pretty good with leaving it at 10 there. Okay, and we'll get a blood gas a little later on. High respiratory rate, 30 to 35 is usually a good starting point. Sometimes, so you can customize what alarms are available and what ones are not on the Hamilton vents, as well as a lot of others. So you may not always have a low tidal volume alarm. I do got it set up on here. Let us know if leak or massive air trapping or something. Usually to 100 to 150 below your set point is pretty good. So this guy's set at 500. I'm going to set him at like 400. Okay. Likewise, if you're going to do 150 to 300 above or something like that in the adult realm. So if I wanted to do 650 would be plenty good there. Really will only probably take place if patients, double stacking or something like that. Things we'll get into. Apnea time. You set an apnea time, but on the Hamiltons, in a mode like this where you can't truly go apneic and not get any support, you're not going to have any apnea settings. If you run an IMV or something with really, really low rate or something like that, yeah, you can have backup settings kind of taking place, but it should not be an issue here. 20 seconds is pretty standard. If you are running a mode where a patient could go apneic and you want there to be appropriate backup settings, you want to go ahead and confirm those. All right, and this vent defaults to doing those as pressure ventilation. Trying to think what else with this ventilator. That is about it as far as finding some of the measurements. Let me scroll back a little bit and I'm going to show you a couple of things. You got pre-silence for your alarm, so for 2 minutes, it silence any current alarms that are, won't ding or anything like that if anything goes off, but you will be able to actually see, if an alarm's going off. So like I'll make it a high pressure here really quickly. I'll show you pressure limiting. So if you see I'm holding my lung, you can see I'm hitting my high pressure, it's dumping the breath. My tidal volume's not delivered. It's prematurely pressure cycling the breath, okay? So it's still flashing, it's still doing everything, dumping that breath, opening the safety valve, okay? It's flashing red, so a high priority alarm, but it's not making that audible noise until I kind of come in here. You can see the yellow or a little bit low priority. Patient's ventilating here again. Everything was silenced. Okay, you wouldn't want to leave that silenced and step out of the room. So by hitting that, it's going to go ahead and reactivate or re-enable all your alarms. Okay. You got the quick access 100% O2 button. So if you're suctioning, getting ready to extubate, some acute events is happening, you're trying to figure things out, you could go ahead and kind of do that here. You do have built-in nebulizer feature. Okay, so on this one I got a built-in AirGen cable that I could hook up and do vibrating mesh neb. You can run and that's just a little module on the front of this here. You can do an old school jet neb, and you can actually, there's a port on the front that accepts oxygen tubing, and you could run that inline so you're not adding any extra flow into the system, and you can turn that on and off. If you get into like the system features and you go to nebulizer, you can run pneumatic versus AirGen. You can do continuous neb. You can do it inspiration only, inspiration, exhalation, all that different stuff. You can change duration and things like that as well. I didn't really talk about IntelliCuff. Once again, this thing can set your cuff pressure with an attachment that resides in a pilot balloon. I'll show you guys that in class. I'm not going to really get into all that here right now because I have to zoom out and things. Trying to think what else with this. People may make a mistake and hit the lung button here and think it's a plateau. All it is manual breath, so it's going to give a breath at these current parameters here. Okay, so you need to know how to do a plateau. If you got a call about a patient and something, the alarm was going off and the nurse wasn't really sure, you can hit events and it'll show you everything that's been taking place, any changes, any alarms that are kind of taking place. By scrolling over here, you can look at all events, you can see everything that's kind of taking place. So it can kind of get you zoomed in on what's been going on with your patient and everything like that. Once again, you can also do all sorts of trends and things. You could trend, you could trend your minute ventilation, respiratory rate, you could trend your peak pressures, things like that. You could do all sorts of capabilities if you're interested in that. So you can see what a patient's been doing over a period of time, things along those lines, okay? And then plot all these data points for you, things we'll get into a little bit later on. I'm trying to think what else. If you're going to change modes, once again, you can kind of access this from, the same way I kind of showed you earlier on. Let's say we're getting ready to put this ventilator in standby. We would simply go ahead and hit the power button and ask you, do you want to activate standby? Yes, you can. So I not only do I do this obviously in situations where you routinely do a standby, but if I show up and I'm bagging a patient for some acute event, I like to hit standby, not just because it's not spraying stuff and honking at me. it's a good way to keep track of time. So sometimes in a acute situation, you know, minutes fly by and you don't realize you've been in a situation for 20 or 30 minutes. It gives you a good way of being able to kind of recap how long you've been in a room and kind of reiterate some of the different things been going on to a physician and things like that. All right. So at this point, you know, if the patient was extubated, that's fine. If we were doing a startup, or say this patient got reintubated right away or something like that, you can pull up last patient. Usually, like when we came from our first screen, it was new patient. So if you do last patient, it will pull up the previous vent settings and things like that. And I think that's a pretty good intro for volume CMV for the Hamilton Vent series. Once again, volume CMV is S-CMV on this ventilator. I hope that's helpful. I'll do some other ones for like pressure ventilation. We'll get into APV, and I already got some stuff on ASV and volume support and stuff. So I hope that helps, and there'll be more to come. Thanks.